What would you do if a stranger left you everything? And the only condition was that you had to figure out why. Lenora Finch was 34 years old, 8 months behind on rent, and standing in a lawyer's parking lot trying to decide if she had enough gas to drive home. She had $12 in her checking account. She had a box of her late mother's costume jewelry she'd been meaning to sell. She had a 2009 Honda with a crack running across the windshield, like a sentence that had given up halfway through. What she did not have was any reason to believe that a Tuesday afternoon in November could change the entire direction of her life. The letter had come 3 days earlier, slipped between a water bill and a coupon circular for a pizza place that had closed 2 years ago. The envelope was cream-colored and heavy, the kind of paper that announces itself before you even open it. The return address listed a law firm in Asheville, North Carolina, Holton Drummond, attorneys at law. Lenora had stared at it for a long moment at the kitchen counter, still in her work clothes, still carrying the specific exhaustion of someone who had spent 8 hours fielding calls at an insurance claims office and had nothing to show for it but a headache and lukewarm coffee. She almost threw it away. That's the part she would think about later, when everything had changed. She almost threw it away. Inside was a single sheet of paper, formal language, clean margins, informing her that a woman named Harriet Colbrook, age 81, had passed away on October 28th and had named Lenora Finch as the sole beneficiary of her estate. The estate included a 12-acre property in the mountains outside Asheville, a farmhouse, 2 outbuildings, and all personal possessions therein. Lenora had read the letter 4 times. Then she sat down on the kitchen floor because her legs had stopped cooperating. She had never heard the name Harriet Colbrook in her life. The drive from Knoxville took just under 3 hours. Lenora had called her supervisor and said she had a family emergency, which felt both like a lie and, strangely, like the truth. She drove with the windows cracked even though it was 40 degrees outside, because she needed the cold air to keep her thinking straight. Her mother had died 8 months ago. A slow, grinding illness that had eaten through the woman's savings, and then through Lenora's, and then through everything else. There had been no estate, no letter from a lawyer, just a hospital bill and a closet full of clothes that still smelled like her mother's perfume, and a silence in the apartment so thick Lenora had started leaving the television on just to fill it. She had no siblings, no father worth mentioning. No one who would have called Harriet Colbrook a mutual connection. The law office was on a quiet street lined with Bradford pear trees that had long since dropped their leaves. The lawyer, a compact man named Stuart Holt, had the manner of someone who delivered unusual news with enough regularity that he'd learned to simply wait while the other person processed it. He was perhaps 60. Reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, a yellow legal pad in front of him that he didn't write on once. "I understand this is unexpected," he said. "Do you know why she chose me?" Lenora asked. He folded his hands on the desk. "Mrs. Colbrook left a letter, sealed. She instructed that it be given to you only after you had seen the property." He paused. She was quite specific about the order of things. Lenora stopped. "That's unusual. Mrs. Colbrook was an unusual woman," he said, without any particular judgment in his voice. She had signed the papers that afternoon. There were no other heirs contesting the will. Harriet Colbrook had been a widow for 20 years. No children, no surviving family of record. The estate passed clean and clear to Lenora Finch, a woman she had apparently chosen for reasons she was not yet willing to explain. The property was 20 minutes outside the city, up a road that climbed steadily into the hills and narrowed in a way that made Lenora grip the steering wheel tighter. The GPS lost signal twice. The trees on either side were bare and grey and very still, and when she finally turned onto the gravel drive marked by a weathered wooden post with the name Colbrook burned into it, she felt something she couldn't quite name. Not excitement, not fear, something sitting directly between the two. The farmhouse appeared around a bend in the drive, and she stopped the car. It was old, 2 stories, white paint gone grey with time, a front porch that sagged slightly on the left side. The roof of the smaller outbuilding had partially collapsed. There were rose bushes along the front walk, dormant now, their bare canes tangled and overgrown into something that looked more like a warning than a welcome. Beyond the house, the land fell away into a shallow meadow, and beyond that, the dark wall of the mountain. It was the most beautiful and most forsaken thing she had ever seen. She sat in the car for a full 5 minutes before she got out. The key Stuart Holt had given her was old-fashioned, the kind with an oval head and a long barrel, and it fit the front door lock with a solidity that felt almost ceremonial. The door swung inward, and the smell came out to meet her, old wood, dried lavender, and underneath it something faintly sweet she couldn't identify. Not unpleasant, just old, like a room that had been holding its breath. The interior was dim, the windows filmed with dust, and the light outside already fading. Lenora found a lamp on a side table near the door, tried the switch, and was surprised when it came on. The electricity was still connected. She would learn later that Stuart Holt had arranged it, anticipating her visit. The front room was furnished simply. A sofa with a quilt folded over the back, 2 armchairs near a fireplace, a low wooden coffee table with a ring stain on one corner. There were photographs on the mantel. Lenora crossed to them and picked up the nearest one. A black and white image of 2 young women standing in a field, squinting into the sun, both of them laughing at something happening just outside the frame. They looked to be in their 20s. On the back, someone had written in pencil, H&L, summer 1968. H&L Lenora set the photograph down carefully. She moved through the house slowly, room by room. The kitchen was clean but sparse, the counters wiped down, a single mug hanging on a hook near the stove. On the kitchen table, a small cactus in a clay pot was still alive, barely but alive, leaning toward the window with a determination that struck Lenora as almost human. Upstairs were 2 bedrooms, the larger one clearly Harriet's, her reading glasses on the nightstand, a library book with a bookmark still in it, a cardigan draped over the back of a chair, as if she had just stepped out and would be back shortly. The second bedroom was smaller, simply furnished, and had the particular blankness of a room that had been waiting a long time for a specific purpose. In the corner of the second bedroom was a door, not a closet. The proportions were wrong, too narrow, and when Lenora tried the handle, it didn't open. The keyhole was different from the front door. The key she'd been given didn't fit. She stood in front of that door for a long moment, the cold of the empty house settling around her, and felt the certainty of something she couldn't explain. This door was the reason she was here. She drove back to Asheville and checked into the cheapest motel she could find, and lay on the bed without taking her coat off and stared at the ceiling. She called Stuart Holt's office and left a message asking about the second key. She ordered a grilled cheese sandwich from the diner next door and ate it without tasting it. She thought about driving back to Knoxville. She thought about the $12 in her checking account and the water bill and the silence in her apartment. She thought about the photograph, H&L, summer 1968. Who was L? In the morning, she found the note. She had gone back to the farmhouse at first light, unable to stay away, and was standing on the front porch when she noticed it. A small envelope tucked into the gap between the porch railing and the post, so precisely placed it could only have been left deliberately. Her name was on the front, not typed, handwritten in a shaky but legible script. Inside was a single sentence, "Don't let them tell you it isn't yours." There was no signature. Lenora stood on the porch with the note in her hand and looked out at the bare meadow and the mountain beyond it, and for the first time since the letter from the lawyer had arrived, she didn't feel confused. She felt, with a clarity that surprised her, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She met Arlo Fenwick on her second day at the property. He appeared from the tree line at the edge of the meadow while she was walking the land, an old man in a canvas jacket, moving with the deliberate care of someone whose joints had opinions. He was perhaps 75, thin and weather-worn, with eyes the particular grey-blue of overcast sky, and a way of looking at her that was more assessment than greeting. He had a border collie at his heel that he hadn't introduced. "You're the one Harriet left the place to," he said. It wasn't a question. "Lenora Finch," she said. "Did you know her well?" 52 years, he said. "I live on the property adjacent. We shared a fence line." He glanced toward the house. "She told me you were coming." "Eventually she told you about me?" He looked back at her, and something in his expression shifted. A careful recalibration. "She told me there was someone she wanted to make sure got this place before the wrong people did." He paused. "She didn't use your name until the last few months. The wrong people." Lenora filed that away. "What wrong people?" But Arlo Fenwick shook his head slowly, the way people do when they've decided the answer is not theirs to give. "There's a door upstairs," he said. "Second bedroom. The key's in the kitchen, under the cactus pot." He turned and walked back toward the trees, the border collie following without a glance back. Lenora stood in the meadow for a moment, then turned and walked quickly toward the house. Under the cactus pot, still leaning its impossible lean toward the light, was a small key, tarnished and cold. She took the stairs 2 at a time. The door opened onto a narrow room that ran the length of the back wall, low-ceilinged and lit by a single small window. It was not a closet. It was, she realized slowly, a study, a working space. The walls were lined with shelves, and on the shelves were boxes, bankers' boxes, shoe boxes, wooden crates, all labeled in that same shaky handwriting. Along one wall was a folding table with a typewriter on it, and next to the typewriter, a stack of paper, and on top of that stack, a sealed envelope with Lenora's name on it. The letter Stuart Holt had told her about. The one she had to see the property before she could read. She sat down on the one wooden stool in the room and opened it. "Dear Lenora," Harriet Colbrook had written, "I expect you are confused, and I imagine you are frightened, and I want you to know that both of those things are exactly right. What I am about to tell you will not make things simpler, at least not immediately, but I have learned, in 81 years of living, that simple and true are not the same thing, and it is almost always worth choosing truth. My name is Harriet Vance Colbrook. I was born in 1943 in this house, and I have lived here for most of my life, and I intend to be buried on this land, which I imagine has already happened by the time you read this. I am telling you this not to be sentimental, but because you need to understand. This place is not an accident. It is not an inheritance in the ordinary sense. It is a repair. Your grandmother's name was Lillian Ann Marsh. She was my closest friend for the first 30 years of my life, and she is the reason I am writing this letter to you." Lenora stopped reading. She looked up at the shelves, at the boxes, at the typewriter. She looked back at the letter. Her mother had never spoken about her own mother. When Lenora was small, she had learned not to ask. The grandmother was a closed door, a locked room, a subject that made her mother's face do something complicated and then go still. All Lenora knew was that the woman had left, had walked away from her family when Lenora's mother was barely 3 years old, and had never come back. That was the whole story, as far as she'd ever been given. She kept reading. Harriet wrote clearly, without self-pity and without excessive explanation, the way people write when they have thought a very long time about what they need to say. Lillian Marsh had not abandoned her family by choice. She had been pushed out, methodically and deliberately, by a man named Aldous Marsh, her husband, who had, over the course of several years, isolated her, emptied the joint bank accounts, and then arranged for a judge, a friend of a friend, a favor called in, to declare her unfit as a mother. It had taken Aldous Marsh 4 years to engineer Lillian's removal from her own life. He had been patient and thorough, and he had been helped by money, which in that county, in that era, was the same thing as being helped by law. Lillian had fought. Harriet described it in careful detail, the letters, the appeals, the attorney who had taken her case for 2 years, and then quietly stepped away when certain pressures were applied. She described Lillian sitting in this very room, at this typewriter, drafting correspondence to agencies and offices that sent back form letters or nothing at all. She described the night, in the winter of 1971, when Lillian had arrived at the farmhouse in the dark, with nothing but a coat and a paper bag of documents, and had sat at the kitchen table and said, with the flatness of someone who had finished grieving and arrived at something harder, "I can't get her back, but I need someone to know the truth." Lillian Marsh had died in 1989 in a small apartment in Charlotte without ever seeing her daughter again. She had left everything she had, which was almost nothing, to Harriet, with one instruction. When it's safe, find the girl. It had taken Harriet 35 years to locate Lenora. The Marsh family had been careful about that too. Lenora sat in the narrow room for a long time. The light through the small window shifted from morning white to the flat grey of midday, and she didn't move. She read the letter twice. Then she set it down and looked at the boxes. She started with the one labelled Legal, 1968 to 1973. Inside were copies of court documents, letters, a small notebook in Lillian's handwriting. She didn't read everything. She couldn't, not yet. But she held the notebook for a while, feeling the weight of it, the specific gravity of a person's effort preserved in paper. She was still sitting there when she heard the car, the sound of gravel, an engine cutting off, a door. She went to the small window and looked out. Below, in the drive, was a black SUV she didn't recognize. A man was getting out, large, in a dark coat, moving toward the house with the purposeful ease of someone who doesn't expect to be stopped. Lenora stayed very still. She heard the front door, which she had locked, and then the distinct sound of a key working a lock. A key that fit, that turned, and then footsteps below. Her heart was loud in her ears, and she pulled the door of the study nearly closed and stood behind it, pressing herself against the wall. The footsteps moved through the downstairs. She heard things being moved, drawers, she thought, cabinets. Then the footsteps came up the stairs. They stopped outside the second bedroom. A long pause, then a voice. A man's voice, smooth and unhurried. "I know you're in there." Lenora didn't breathe. "My name is Warren Colbrook," the voice said. "I'm Harriet's nephew, and I think we should have a conversation before you get any further into those boxes." She opened the door because she had calculated, in those few seconds behind it, that not opening it was a worse position. He was standing in the middle of the bedroom, tall, early 50s, with a broad, well-maintained face, and the particular ease of a man who had been comfortable for so long he'd forgotten what it felt like not to be. He looked at her with something she could only describe as patient appetite. "She told me she'd found someone," he said, almost conversationally. "I didn't think you'd come this fast." "I'm the beneficiary," Lenora said. "This is my property." Warren Colbrook smiled, and the smile didn't change his eyes. "My aunt was not well toward the end. Her judgment was compromised. I have documentation from her physician." He reached into his coat and produced a folded sheaf of papers. "This will is going to be contested. It's a formality, really, but I want to be fair to you." He set the papers on the bed. "There's an offer in there, $180,000. For the property, the contents, all of it. You walk away, no complications." Lenora looked at the papers. She thought about $12. She thought about the water bill, the crack in the windshield, the silence in her apartment. She looked back at Warren Colbrook. "My grandmother's name was Lillian Ann Marsh," she said. Something moved across his face. "Fast and then gone." "I don't know what Harriet told you." "She told me everything." Lenora watched him, and she kept everything. 50 years of documents in boxes with labels on them. She paused, including correspondence with a judge named Caldwell. "Do you know that name?" The ease in his posture didn't disappear, but it tightened, adjusted. "You don't know what you're talking about," he said, and the smooth quality was still in his voice, but thinner now, like paint over something that wasn't primed. "I know enough," Lenora said. "I know your family spent 40 years making sure no one could find this place's history. I know Harriet spent 35 years making sure someone could." He picked up the offer papers and held them toward her again. "This is a generous number. It won't be this number if you make me go through the courts." And this is the moment, if Lenora Finch is being honest, that she understood for the first time in her life what her grandmother had felt. Not the grief. She had known grief. but the specific and clarifying sensation of being offered money to disappear and feeling somewhere in the floor of herself the refusal. "Get out of my house," she said. Warren Colbrook did not go quietly, but he went. He made 2 phone calls on the porch that she watched from the upstairs window, and then he got back into the black SUV and drove down the gravel road and was gone. She called Stuart Holt before the sound of the engine had faded. He was not surprised. He had been expecting Warren to surface. He had, he said carefully, taken the precaution of having the most sensitive documents in the study catalogued before Harriet's death, with copies held at the firm. The judge named Caldwell had been dead for 12 years, but his son was a sitting state representative, and the correspondence, if it became public, was relevant to several ongoing questions about how certain family court decisions had been made in that county in the early 1970s. "This won't be simple," Stuart Holt told her, "but simple and true are different things." Lenora recognized the sentence. She had just read it an hour ago in a letter from a woman she'd never met. "I know," she said. "She told me that." She stayed. "That was the whole of it, and also the entirety of it." She stayed. It took 11 months for the legal challenge to be fully dismissed. During that time, Lenora drove back and forth between Knoxville and Asheville more times than she could count, slept in the farmhouse on a cot she'd bought at a hardware store, and spent more weekends than she could count in the narrow room with the boxes, reading her grandmother's handwriting in a cold that the small space heater she'd bought barely touched. She got a transfer to an insurance claims office in Asheville. She fixed the porch. She learned, slowly, which boards in the floor creaked and which window latch had to be coaxed, and which section of the rose bushes, when she finally cut them back in March, had been alive underneath all along. Arlo Fenwick came by on Saturdays, usually without announcing himself, usually with something practical, firewood or a casserole his wife had made, or knowledge about why the water pressure in the kitchen dropped in cold weather. He didn't talk about Harriet often, but when he did, it was with the directness of a man who had already done his mourning and arrived somewhere solid. He'd loved her, Lenora eventually understood. Not romantically, or perhaps once romantically, or perhaps in the way that sometimes accumulates over 52 years of adjacent living into something that defies category. She didn't ask. He didn't say. One afternoon in April, when the rose canes had put out their first pale green unfurling, Lenora found, in a shoebox at the back of the 3rd shelf, a photograph she hadn't seen before, larger than the one on the mantel. Color this time, but faded, the particular color fade of the early 1970s that turns everything slightly amber. 2 women sitting at a kitchen table. Harriet's kitchen table. She recognized the window. Cups of coffee in front of them, both looking at the camera. The younger of the 2 women had Lenora's mother's nose, had Lenora's own hands, the same shape of the knuckles. On the back, Lillian's last visit. March 1971. She leaves tomorrow. We both know what this means. Lenora sat with the photograph for a long time. She thought about what it means to protect something on behalf of someone who won't live to see it protected. She thought about patience of a kind she had never been asked to practice. She thought about her mother, who had grown up not knowing why she'd been left, and what that not knowing had cost her, and what it had cost Lenora, downstream, without either of them understanding the source. She thought, someone kept the truth. For 50 years, someone kept it, and then made sure it found the right hands. Then she put the photograph on the shelf by itself, where she could see it from the stool. There are stories that end with revelations, and there are stories that end with choices. And sometimes, if you're paying attention, you realize the revelation was always the choice, dressed differently. Lenora Finch didn't receive a fortune. She received a truth, housed in a farmhouse, preserved in boxes, passed hand to hand across half a century by a woman she never got to thank. She received, against all reason, the thing that had been taken from her family before she existed to know she was missing it. If you had been in her position, if a stranger had looked at your life and decided, quietly and without your knowledge, to repair something broken before you were born, what would you have done with it? She chose to stay. She chose to let the repair hold. If this story moved you, if Lillian and Harriet's 50-year vigil stayed with you the way it stayed with us, share it with someone who believes that what's buried stays buried. Tell them it doesn't always. And if you want to be here for the next story, you know what to do.